This is Chapter 8, Book 2 of A Journey in Other Worlds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. A Journey in Other Worlds, Book 2, Chapter 8, Sportsman's Reveries. Feeling grateful to the huge tortoise for the good service he had rendered, they shot a number of the great snakes that were gliding on the ground and placed them where he would find them on awakening. Then they picked their way carefully towards stretches on which the grass was shortest. When they had gone about 2 miles and had already reached higher ground, they came to a ridge of rock running at right angles to their course. This they climbed, and on looking over the edge of the crest beheld a sight that made their hearts stand still. A monster somewhat resembling an alligator, except that the back was arched, was waddling about perhaps 75 yards from them. It was 60 feet long, and to the top of its scales was at least 25 feet high. It was constantly moving, and the travellers noticed with some dismay that its motion was far more rapid than they would have supposed it could be. "It is also a dinosaur," said the professor, watching it sharply, "and very closely resembles the Stegosaurus ungulatus, restored in the museums. The question is, what shall we do with the living specimen now that we have it?" "Our chairman," said Ayrault, "must find a way to kill it, so that we may examine it closely." "The trouble is," said Bearwarden, "our bullets will explode before they penetrate the scales. In the absence of any way of making a passage for an explosive ball by means of a solid one, we must strike a vital spot. His scales being no harder than the trunk of a tree, we can wound him terribly by touching him anywhere. But there is no object in doing this unless we can kill him, especially as there is no deep stream, such as would have delayed the mastodon in reaching us, to protect us here. We must spread out so as to divert his attention from one to another." After some consultation, it was decided that Cortlandt, who had only a shotgun, should remain where they were, while Bearwarden and Ayrault moved some distance to the right and left. At a signal from Cortlandt, who was to attract the monster's attention, the wings were to advance simultaneously. These arrangements they carried out to the letter. When Bearwarden and Ayrault had gone about 25 yards on either side, the doctor imitated the peculiar grunting sound of an alligator, at which the colossal monster turned and faced him, while Bearwarden and Ayrault moved to the attack. The plan of this was good, for with his attention fixed on 3 objects, the dinosaur seemed confused, and though Bearwarden and Ayrault had good angles from which to shoot, there was no possibility of their hitting each other. They therefore advanced steadily, with their rifles half up. Though their own danger increased with each step, in the event of their missing, the chance of their shooting wild decreased, the idea being to reach the brain through the eye. Cortlandt's part had also its risks, for, being entirely defenceless with his shotgun against the large creature, whose attention it was his duty to attract, he staked all on the marksmanship of his friends. Not considering this, however, he stood his ground, having the thumb-piece of his Winchester magazine shoved up and ready to make a noisy diversion, if necessary, in behalf of either wing. Having aroused the monster's curiosity, Cortlandt sprang up, waving his arms and his gun. The dinosaur lowered his head, as if to charge, thereby bringing it to a level with the rifles, either of which could have given it the fatal shot. But as their fingers pressed the triggers, the reptile soared up 30 feet in the air. Ayrault pulled for his first sight, shooting through the lower jaw and shivering that member, while Bearwarden changed his aim and sighted straight for the heart. In an instant the monster was down again, just missing Ayrault's head as he stepped back, and Bearwarden's rifle poured a stream of explosive bullets against its side, rending and blowing away the heavy scales. Having drawn the dinosaur's attention to himself, he retreated, while Ayrault renewed the attack. Cortlandt, seeing that the original plan had miscarried, poured showers of small shot against the huge beast's face. Finally, one of Ayrault's balls exploded in the brain, and all was over. "We have killed it at last," said Bearwarden, "but the first attack, though artistic, had not the brilliant results we expected. These creatures' mode of fighting is doubtless somewhat similar to that of the kangaroo, which it is said puts its forepaws gently, almost lovingly, on a man's shoulders, and then disembowels him by the rapid movement of a hind leg. But we shall get used to their method, and can do better next time." Then they reloaded their weapons, and, while Cortlandt examined their victim from a naturalist's point of view, Bearwarden and Ayrault secured the heart, which they thought would be the most edible part, the operation being rendered possible by the amount of armor the explosive balls had stripped off. "Tomorrow," said Bearwarden, "we must make it a point to get some well-fed birds, for I can roast, broil, or fricassee them to a turn. Life is too short to live on this meat in such a sportsman's paradise. In any case, there can be no end of mastodons, mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, moa birds, and all such shooting." As the sun was already near the horizon, they chose a dry, sandy place to secure as much immunity as possible from nocturnal visits, and after procuring a supply of water from a pool, proceeded to arrange their camp for the night. They first laid out the protection wires, setting them while the sun still shone. Next they built a fire, and prepared their evening meal. While they ate it, twilight became night, and the fireflies, twinkling in legions in the neighbouring valley, seemed like the lamps of a great city. "Their lights," said Bearwarden, pointing to them, "are not as fine as the jellyfish will o' the wisps were last night, but they are not so dangerous. No gymnotus or electric eel that I have ever seen compared with them, and I am convinced that any one of us they might have touched would have been in kingdom come." The balmy air soothed the travellers' brows as they reclined against mounds of sand, while the flowers in the valley sent up their dying notes. One by one the moons arose, till 4, among them the Lilliputian, discovered by Professor Barnard in 1893, were in the sky, flooding the landscape with their silvery light, and something in the surroundings touched a sympathetic chord in the men. "Oh, that I were young again," said Cortlandt, "and had life before me! I should like to remain here, and grow up with this planet, in which we already perceive the next new world. The beauties of earth are barren compared with the scenes we have here." "You remember," replied Bearwarden, "how Cicero defends old age in his De Senectute, and shows that while it has almost everything that youth has, it has also a sense of calm and many things besides." "Yes," answered Cortlandt, "but, while plausible, it does not convince. The pleasures of age are largely negative, the old being happy when free from pain." "Since the highest joy of life," said Ayrault, "is coming to know our Creator, I should say the old, being further advanced, would be the happier of the two. I should never regard this material life as greatly to be prized for itself. You remember the old song, 'O youth, when we come to consider the pain, the toil, and the strife, The happiest man of all is the one who has finished his life." "I suspect," continued Ayrault, "that the man who reaches even the lowest plane in paradise will find far more beautiful visions than any we have here." As they had but little rest the night before, they were all tired. The warm breeze swayed the long dry grass, causing it to give out a soft rustle. All birds except the flitting bats were asleep among the tall ferns or on the great trees that spread their branches towards heaven. There was nothing to recall a picture of the huge monsters they had seen that day, or of the still more to be dreaded terror these had borne witness to. Thus night closes the activities of the day, and in its serene grandeur the soul has time to think. While they thought, however, drowsiness overcame them, and in a little while all were asleep. The double line of protection wires encircled them like a silent guard, while the methodical ticking of the alarm clock that was to wake them at the approach of danger and register the hour of interruption formed a curious contrast to the irregular cries of the nighthawks in the distance. Time and again some huge iguanodon or a hypsoopus would pass, shaking the ground with its tread, but so implicit was the travellers' trust in the vigilance of their mechanical and tireless watch that they slept on as calmly and unconcernedly as though they had been in their beds at home, while the tick was as constant and regular as a sentry's march. The wires, of course, did not protect them from creatures having wings, and they ran some risk of a visitation from the blood-sucking bats. The far-away volcanoes occasionally sent up sheets of flame, which in the distance were like summer lightning. The torrents of lava and crashes that had sounded so thunderous when near were now like the murmur of the ocean's ebb tide, lulling the terrestrials to deeper sleep. The pale moons were at intervals momentarily obscured by the rushing clouds in the upper air, only to reappear soon afterwards as serene as before. All nature seemed at rest. Shortly before dawn there was an unusually heavy step. A moment later the ever vigilant batteries poured forth their current, and the clang of the alarm bell made the still night ring. In an instant the three men were awake, each resting on one knee, with their backs towards the centre, and their polished barrels raised. It was not long before they perceived the intruder by moonlight. A huge monster of the Triceratops prorsus species had entered the camp. It was shaped something like an elephant, but it had 10 or 12 times the bulk, being over 40 feet in length, not including the long, thick tail. The head carried 2 huge horns on the forehead, and 1 on the nose. "A plague on my shotgun," said Cortlandt. "Had I known how much of this kind of game we should see, I too should have brought a rifle." The monster was entangled in the wires, and in another second would have stepped on the batteries that were still causing the bell to ring. "Aim for the heart," said Bearwarden to Ayrault. "When you show me his ribs, I will follow you in the hole." Ayrault instantly fired for a point just back of the left foreleg. The explosion had the same effect as on the mastodon, removing a half barrel of hide, etc., and the next second Bearwarden sent a bullet less than an inch from where Ayrault's had stopped. Before the colossus could turn, each had caused several explosions in close proximity to the first. The creature was of course terribly wounded, and several ribs were cracked, but no ball had gone through. With a roar it made straight for the woods, and with surprising agility, running fully as fast as an elephant. Bearwarden and Ayrault kept up a rapid fire at the left hind leg, and soon completely disabled it. The dinosaur, however, supported itself with its huge tail, and continued to make good time. Knowing they could not give it a fatal wound at the intervening distance, in the uncertain light they stopped firing, and set out in pursuit. Cortlandt paused to stop the bell that still rang, and then put his best foot foremost in regaining his friends. For half a mile they hurried along, until, seeing by the quantity of blood on the ground that they were in no danger of losing the game, they determined to save their strength. The trail entered the woods by a narrow ravine, passed through what proved to be but a belt of timber, and then turned north to the right. Presently, in the semi-darkness, they saw the monster's head against the sky. He was browsing among the trees, tearing off the young branches, and the hunters succeeded in getting within 75 yards before being discovered. Just as he began to run, the two rifles again fired, this time at the right hind leg, which they succeeded in hamstringing. After that, the Triceratops prorsus was at their mercy, and they quickly put an end to its suffering. "The sun is about to rise," said Bearwarden. "In a few minutes we shall have enough light." They cut out a dozen thick slices of tenderloin steak, and soon were broiling and eating a substantial breakfast. "There are not as many spectators to watch us eat here," said Cortlandt, "as in the woods. I suggest that, after returning to camp for our blankets and things, we steer for the Callisto, via this Triceratops, to see what creatures have been attracted by the body." On finishing their meal, they returned to the place at which they had passed the night. Having straightened the protection wires, which had become twisted, and arranged their impedimenta, they set out, and were soon once more beside their latest victim. This is the end of Chapter 8 in Book 2 of A Journey in Other Worlds. Recording by Tom Weiss.
This is Chapter 9, Book 2 of A Journey in Other Worlds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. A Journey in Other Worlds, Book 2, Chapter 9, The Honey of Death. At first, nothing seemed to have been disturbed, when they suddenly perceived that both forelegs were missing. On further examination, they found that the ponderous tail, 7 feet in diameter, was cut through in 2 places, the thicker portion having disappeared, and that the heavy bones in this extremity of the vertebral column had been severed like straws. The cut surfaces were but little cooler than the interior of the body, showing how recently the mutilation had been effected. "By all the gods!" exclaimed Bearwarden, "it is easy to see the method in this. The hunters have again cut off only those parts that could be easily rolled. These Jovian fellows must have weapons compared with which the old scythe chariots would be but toys, with which they amputate the legs of their victims. We must see to it that their scimitars do not come too near to us, and I venture to hope that in our bullets they will find their match. What say you, doctor?" "I see no depression such as such heavy bodies would necessarily have made had they been rolled along the ground. Neither does it seem to me that these curious tracks in the sand are those of men. The loose earth looked as if the cross ties of some railroad had been removed, the space formerly occupied having been but partly filled, and these depressions were across the probable direction of motion. Whatever was capable of chasing mastodons and carrying such weights," said Ayrault, "will, I suspect, have little to fear from us. Probably nothing short of light artillery would leave much effect." "I dare say," replied Bearwarden. "We had better give the unknown quantity a wide berth, though I would give a year's salary to see what it is like. The absence of other tracks shows that his confreres leave Scissorjaw alone." Keeping a sharp lookout in all directions, they resumed their march along the third side of the square which was to bring them back to the Callisto. Their course was parallel to the stream, and on comparatively high ground. Cortlandt's gun did good service, bringing down between 50 and 60 birds that usually allowed them to get as near as they pleased, and often seemed unwilling to leave their branches. By the time they were ready for luncheon, they saw it would be dark in an hour. As the rapidity of the planet's rotation did not give them a chance to become tired, they concluded not to pitch their camp, but to resume the march by moonlight, which would be easy in the high, open country they were traversing. While in the quest of firewood, they came upon great heaps of bones, mostly those of birds, and were attracted by the tall, bell-shaped flowers growing luxuriantly in their midst. These exhaled a most delicious perfume, and at the centre of each flower was a viscous liquid, the colour of honey. "If this tastes as well as it looks," said Bearwarden, "it will come in well for dessert," saying which he thrust his finger into the recesses of the flower, intending to taste the essence. Quietly, but like a flash, the flower closed, his hand being nearly caught, and badly scratched by the long, sharp thorns that now appeared at the edges. "Ha!" he exclaimed, "a sensitive, and you may almost say a man-eating plant. This doubtless has been the fate of these birds, whose bones now lie bleaching at its feet, after they have nourished its lips with their lives. No doubt the plant has use for them still, since their skeletons may serve to fertilize its roots." Wishing to investigate further, Bearwarden placed one of the birds they had shot within the bell of another flower, which immediately contracted with such force that they saw drops of blood squeezed out. After some minutes, the flower opened, as beautiful as ever, and discharged an oblong ball compressed to about the size of a hen's egg, though the bird that was placed within it had been as large as a small duck. Towards evening these flowers sent up their most beautiful song, to hear which flocks of birds came from far and near, alighting on the trees, and many were lured to death by the siren strains and the honey. Before resuming their journey, the travellers paid a parting visit to the bell-shaped lilies on the pyramids of bones. The flowers were closed for the night, and the travellers saw by the moonlight that the white mounds were simply alive with diamond-headed snakes. These coiled themselves, flattened their heads, and set up such a hissing on the explorers' approach that they were glad to retire and leave this curious contrast of hideousness and beauty to the fireflies and the moons. Marching along in Indian file, the better to avoid treading on the writhing serpents that strewed the ground, they kept on for about 2 hours. They frequently passed huge heaps or mounds of bones, evidently the remains of bears or other large animals. The carnivorous plants growing at their centre were often like hollow trees, and might easily have received the 3 travellers in one embrace. But as before, the mounds were alive with serpents that evidently made them their homes, and raised an angry hiss whenever the men approached. "The wonder to me," said Bearwarden, "is that these snakes do not protect the game by keeping it from the life-devouring plants. It may be that they do not show themselves by day or when the victims are near, or that the quadrupeds on which these plants live take a pleasure, like deer, in killing them by jumping with all 4 feet upon their backs or in some other way, and after that are entrapped by the flowers. Shortly after midnight they rested for a half hour, but the dawn found them trudging along steadily, though somewhat wearily, and having about completed the third side of their square. Accordingly, they soon made a right-angled turn to the left, and had been picking their way over the rough ground for nearly 2 hours, with the sun already high in the sky, when they noticed a diminution of light. Glancing up, they saw that one of the moons was passing across the sun, and that they were on the eve of a total eclipse. "Since all but the fifth moon," said Cortlandt, "revolve exactly in the plane of Jupiter's equator, any inhabitants that settle there will become accustomed to eclipses, for there must be one of the sun and also of the moons at each revolution, or about 4,500 in every Jovian year. The reason we have seen none before is because we are not exactly on the equator." They had a glimpse of the coronal streamers as the last portion of the sun was covered, and all the other phenomena that attend an eclipse on earth. For a few minutes there was a total return to night. The twinkling stars and other moons shone tranquilly in the sky, and even the noise of the insects ceased. Presently the edge of the sun that had been first obscured reappeared, and then nature went through the phenomenon of an accelerated dawn. Without awaiting a full return of light, the travellers proceeded on their way, and had gone something over 100 yards when Ayrault, who was marching second, suddenly grasped Bearwarden, who was in front, and pointed to a jet-black mass straight ahead, and about 30 yards from a pool of warm water, from which a cloud of vapour arose. The top of the head was about 7 feet high, and the length of the body exceeded 30 feet. The 6 legs looked as strong as steel cables, and were about a foot through, while a huge, bony proboscis 9 feet in length preceded the body. This was carried horizontally between 2 and 3 feet from the ground. Presently a large ground sloth came to the pool to drink, lapping up the water at the sides that had been partly cooled. In an instant the black armoured monster rushed down the slope with the speed of a 19th century locomotive, and seemed about as formidable. The sloth turned in the direction of the sound, and for a moment seemed paralyzed with fear. It then started to run, but it was too late, for the next second the enormously exaggerated ant, for such it was, overtook it. The huge mandible shears that, when closed, had formed the proboscis, snapping viciously, taking off the sloth's legs, and then cutting its body to slivers. The execution was finished in a few seconds, and the ponderous insect carried back about half the sloth to its hiding place, where it leisurely devoured it. "This reminds me," said Bearwarden, "of the old lady who never completed her preparations for turning in without searching for burglars under the bed. Finally she found one, and exclaimed in delight, 'I've been looking for you 50 years, and at last you are here.' The question is, now that we have found our burglar, what shall we do with him?" "I constantly regret not having a rifle," replied Cortlandt, "though it is doubtful if even that would help us here." "Let us sit down and wait," said Ayrault. "There may be an opening soon." Anon a woolly rhinoceros, resembling the rhinoceros tichorhinus that existed contemporaneously on earth with the mammoth, came to drink the water that had partly cooled. It was itself a formidable looking beast, but in an instant the monster again rushed from concealment with the same tremendous speed. The rhinoceros turned in the direction of the sound, and lowering its head, faced the foe. The ant's shears, however, passed beneath the horn, and, fastening upon the left foreleg, cut it off with a loud snap. "Now is our chance!" exclaimed Cortlandt. "We may kill the brute before he is through with the rhinoceros." "Stop a bit, doctor," said Bearwarden. "We have a good record so far. Let us keep our reputation for being sports. Wait till he can attend to us." The encounter was over in less than a minute, 3 of the rhinoceros' legs being taken off, and the head almost severed from the body. Taking up the legs in its mandibles, the murderous creature was returning to its lair, when, with the cry of "Now for the fray!" Bearwarden aimed beneath the body, and blew off one of the farther armoured legs from the inside. "Shoot off the legs on the same side," he counselled Ayrault, while he himself kept up a rapid fire. Cortlandt tried to disconcert the enemy by raining duck shot on its scale protected eyes, while the 2 rifles tore off great masses of the horn that covered the enormously powerful legs. The men separated as they retreated, knowing that one slash of the great shears would cut their 3 bodies in halves if they were caught together. The monster had dropped the remains of the rhinoceros when attacked, and made for the hunters at its top speed, which was somewhat reduced by the loss of one leg. Before it came within cutting distance, however, another on the same side was gone, Ayrault having landed a bullet on a spot already stripped of armour. After this the men had no difficulty in keeping out of its way, though it still moved with some speed, snipping off young trees in its path like grass. Finally, having blown the scales from one eye, the travellers sent in a bullet that exploded in the brain and ended its career. "This has been, by all odds, the most exciting hunt we have had," said Ayrault, "both on account of the determined nature and great speed of the attack, and the almost impossibility of finding a vulnerable spot." "Anything short of explosive bullets," added Bearwarden, "would have been powerless against this beast, for the armour in many places is nearly a foot thick." "This is also the most extraordinary as well as most dangerous creature with which we have had to deal," said Cortlandt, "because it is an enormously enlarged insect, with all the inherent ferocity and strength. It is almost the exact counterpart of an African soldier ant, magnified many 100,000 times. I wonder," he continued thoughtfully, "if our latter day insects may not be the deteriorated, in point of size, descendants of the monsters of mythology and geology, for nothing could be a more terrible or ferocious antagonist than many of our well-known insects, if sufficiently enlarged. No animal now alive has more than a small fraction of the strength, in proportion to its size, of the minutest spider or flea. It may be that through lack of food, difficulties imposed by changing climate, and the necessity of burrowing in winter, or through some other conditions, changed from what they were accustomed to, their size has been reduced, and that the fireflies, huge as they seemed, are a step in advance of this specimen in the march of deterioration or involution, which will end by making them as insignificant as those on earth. These ants have probably come into the woods to lay their eggs, for, from the behaviour of the animals we watched from the turtle, there must have been several, or perhaps a war is in progress between those of a different colour, as on earth, in which case the woods may be full of them. Doubtless the reason the turtle seemed so unconcerned at the general uneasiness of the animals was because he knew he could make himself invulnerable to the marauder by simply closing his shell, and we were unmolested because it did not occur to the ant that any soft-shelled creatures could be on the turtle's back. "I think," said Bearwarden, "it will be the part of wisdom to return to the Callisto, and do the rest of our exploring on Jupiter from a safe height, for though we succeeded in disabling this beauty, it was largely through luck, and had we not done so, we should probably have provided a bon bouche for our deceased friend, instead of standing at his grave. Accordingly, they proceeded, and were delighted, a few minutes later, to see the sunlight reflected from the projectile's polished roof. This is the end of Chapter 9 in Book 2 of A Journey in Other Worlds. Recording by Tom Weiss. This is Chapter 10, Book 2 of A Journey in Other Worlds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. A Journey in Other Worlds, Book 2, Chapter 10. Changing Landscapes. On reaching the Callisto, Ayrault worked the lock he had had placed on the lower door, which, to avoid carrying a key, was opened by a combination. The car's interior was exactly as they had left it, and they were glad to be in it again. "Now," said Bearwarden, "we can have a sound and undisturbed sleep, which is what I want more than anything else. No prowlers can trouble us here, and we shall not need the protection wires." They then opened a window in each side, for the large glass plates, admitting the sun when closed, made the Callisto rather warm, and placed a stout wire netting within them to keep out birds and bats, and then, though it was but little past noon, got into their comfortable beds and slept 9 hours at a stretch. Their strong metal house was securely at rest, receiving the sunlight and shedding the rain and dew as it might have done on earth. No winds or storms, lightnings or floods, could trouble it, while the multiformed monsters of antiquity and mythology, restored in life, with which the terrestrials had been thrown into such close contact, roamed about its polished walls. Not even the fiercest could affect them, and they would but see themselves reflected in any vain assaults. The domed symmetrical cylinder stood there as a monument to human ingenuity and skill, and the travellers' last thought as they fell asleep was, "Man, is this really lord of creation?" The following day, at about noon, they awoke, and had a bath in the warm pool. They saw the armoured mass of the great ant, evidently undisturbed, while the bodies of its victims were already shining skeletons, and raised a small cairn of stones in memory of the struggle they had had there. "We should name this place Kentucky," said Bearwarden, "for it is indeed a dark and bloody ground," and seeing the aptness of the appellation, they entered it so on their charts. While Ayrault got the batteries in shape for resuming work, Bearwarden prepared a substantial breakfast. This consisted of oatmeal and cream, kept hermetically sealed in glass, a dish of roast grouse, coffee, pilot bread, a bottle of sauterne, and another of Rhine wine. "This is the last meal we shall take hereabouts," said their cook, as they plied their knives and forks beneath the trees, "so here is a toast to our adventures, and to all the game we have killed." They drained their glasses in drinking this, after which Bearwarden regaled them with the latest concert hall song which he had at his tongue's end. About an hour before dark they re-entered their projectile, and, as a mark of respect to their little ship, named the great branch of the continent on which they had alighted Callisto Point. They then got under way. The batteries had to develop almost their maximum power to overcome Jupiter's attraction, but they were equal to the task, and the Callisto was soon in the air. Directing their apergy to the mountains towards the interior of the continent, and applying repulsion to any ridge or hill over which they passed, thereby easing the work of the batteries engaged in supporting the Callisto, they were soon sweeping along at 75 to 100 miles an hour. By keeping the projectile just strongly enough charged to neutralize gravitation, they remained for the most part within 200 feet of the ground, seldom rising to an altitude of more than a mile, and were therefore able to keep the windows at the sides open and so obtain an unobstructed view. If, however, at any time they felt oppressed by Jupiter's high barometric pressure and preferred the terrestrial conditions, they had but to rise till the barometer fell to 30. Then, if an object of interest recalled them to sea level, they could keep the Callisto's inside pressure at what they found on the Jovian Mountains by screwing up the windows. On account of the distance of 74,000 miles from Jupiter's equator to the pole, they calculated that going at the speed of 100 miles an hour, night and day, it would take them 25 terrestrial days to reach the pole, even from latitude 2 degrees at which they started. But they knew that, if pressed for time, they could rise above the limits of the atmosphere, and move with planetary speed, while, if they wished a still easier method of pursuing their observation, they had but to remain poised between the sun and Jupiter, beyond the latter's upper air, and photograph or map it as it revolved before them. By sunset they had gone 100 miles. Wishing to push along, they closed the windows, rose higher to avoid any mountain tops that might be invisible in the moonlight, and increased their speed. The air made a gentle humming sound as they shot through it, and towards morning they saw several bright points of light in which they recognized, by the aid of their glasses, sheets of flame and torrents of molten glowing lava, bursting at intervals or pouring steadily from several volcanoes. From this they concluded they were again near an ocean, since volcanoes need the presence of a large body of water to provide steam for their eruptions. With the rising sun they found the scene of the day before entirely changed. They were over the shore of a vast ocean that extended to the left as far as they could see, for the range of vision often exceeded the power of sight. The coastline ran almost due north and south, while the volcanoes that dotted it, and that had been luminous during the night, now revealed their nature only by lines of smoke and vapours. They were struck by the boldness and abruptness of the scenery. The mountains and cliffs had been but little cut down by water and frost action, and seemed in full vigour of their youth, which was what the travellers had a right to expect on a globe that was still cooling and shrinking, and consequently throwing up ridges in the shape of mountains far more rapidly than a planet as matured and quiescent as the earth. The absence of lakes also showed them that there had been no glacial period in the latitudes they were crossing for a very long time. "We can account for the absence of ice action and scratches," said Cortlandt, "in one of two ways. Either the proximity of the internal heat to the surface prevents water from freezing in all latitudes, or Jupiter's axis has always been very nearly perpendicular to its orbit, and consequently the thermometer has never been much below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, for, at the considerable distance we are now from the sun, it is easy to conceive that, with the axis much inclined, there might be cold weather during the northern hemisphere's winter that would last for about 6 of our years, even as near the equator as this. The substantiation of an ice cap at the pole will disprove the first hypothesis, for what we took for ice before alighting may have been but banks of cloud, since, having been in the plane of the planet's equator at the time, we had naturally but a very oblique view of the poles, while the absence of glacial scratches shows, I take it, that though the axis may have been a good deal more inclined than at present, it has not, at all events since Jupiter's Paleozoic period, been as much so as that of Uranus or Venus. The land on Jupiter, corresponding to the Laurentian hills on Earth, must even here have appeared at so remote a period that the first surface it showed must long since have been worn away, and therefore any impressions it received have also been erased. Comparing this land with the photographs we took from space, I should say it is the eastern of the two crescent-shaped continents we found apparently facing each other. Their present form I take to be only the skeleton outline of what they will be at the next period of Jupiter's development. They will, I predict, become more like half moons than crescents, though the profile may be much indented by gulfs and bays, their superficial area being greatly increased and the intervening ocean correspondingly narrowed. We know that North America had a very different shape during the Cretaceous or even the Middle Tertiary period from what it has now, and that the Gulf of Mexico extended up the valley of the Mississippi as far as the Ohio, by the presence of a great coral reef in the Ohio River near Cincinnati. We know also that Florida and the southeastern Atlantic states are a very recent addition to the continent, while the pampas of the Argentine Republic have, in a geological sense, but just been upheaved from the sea by the fact that the rivers are all on the surface, not having had time to cut down their channels below the surrounding country. By similar reasoning, we know that the canon of the Colorado is a very old region, though the precipitateness of its banks is due to the absence of rain, for a local water supply would cut back the banks, having most effect where they were steepest, since at those points it would move with the greatest speed. Thus, the majestic canon owes its existence to two things: the length of time the river has been at work, and the fact that the water flowing through it comes from another region where, of course, there is rain, and that it is merely in transit, and so affects only the bed on which it moves. Granting that this is the eastern of the two continents we observed, it evidently corresponds more in shape to the eastern hemisphere on Earth than to the New World, both of which are set facing one another, since both drain towards the Atlantic Ocean. But the analogy here holds also, for the past outlines of the eastern hemisphere differed radically from what they are now. The Mediterranean Sea was formerly of far greater extent than we see it today, and covered nearly the whole of northern Africa and the old upheaved sea bottom that we see in the desert of Sahara. Much of this great desert, as we know, has a considerable elevation, though part of it is still below the level of the Mediterranean. Perhaps a more striking proof of this than are the remains of fishes and marine life that are found there is the dearth of natural harbours and indentations in Africa's northern coast, while just opposite in southern Europe there are any number, which shows that not enough time has elapsed since Africa's upheaval for liquid or congealed water to produce them. Many of Europe's best harbours, and Boston's in our country, have been dug out by slow ice action in the oft recurring glacial periods. The Black and Caspian seas were larger than we now find them, while the Adriatic extended much farther into the continent, covering most of the country now in the valley of the Po. In Europe the land has, of course, risen also, but so slowly that the rivers have been able to keep their channels cut down, proof of their ability to perform which feat we see when an ancient river passes through a ridge of hills or mountains. The river had doubtless been there long before the mountains began to rise, but their elevation was so gradual that the rate of the river's cutting down equaled or exceeded their coming up, proof of which we have in the patent fact that the ancient river's course remains unchanged, and is at right angles to the mountain chain, from all of which we see that the eastern hemisphere's crescent hollow, of which I take it the Mediterranean, Black, and Caspian Sea depressions are the remains, has been gradually filled in by the elevation of the sea's bottom and the extension of deltas from the detrital matter brought from the high interior of the continents by the rivers or by the combined action of the two. Now, since the Gulf of Mexico has been constantly growing smaller, and the Mediterranean is being invaded by the land, I reason that similar causes will produce like effects here, and give to each continent an area far greater than our entire globe. The stormy ocean we behold in the west, which corresponds to our Atlantic, though it is far more of a mare clausum in the geographical sense, is also destined to become a calm and placid inland sea. There are, of course, modifications of and checks to the laws tending to increase the land area. England was formerly joined to the continent, the land connecting the two having been rather washed away by the waves and great tides than by any sinking of the English Channel's bottom, the whole of which is comparatively shallow. Another case in this kind is seen in Cape Cod and the islands of Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, all of which are washing away so rapidly that they would probably disappear before the next glacial period, were we not engaged in preventing its recurrence. These detached islands and sandbars once formed one large island, which at a still earlier time undoubtedly was joined to the mainland. The sands forming the detached masses are in a great processional march towards the equator, but it is the result simply of winds and waves, there being no indication of subsidence. Along the coast of New Jersey we see denudation and sinking going on together, the well-known sunken forest being an instance of the latter. The border of the continent proper also extends many miles under the ocean before reaching the edge of the Atlantic basin. Volcanic eruptions sometimes demolish parts of headlands and islands, though these recompense us in the amount of material brought to the surface, and in the increased distance they enable water to penetrate, by relieving the interior of part of its heat, for any land they may destroy. This is the end of Chapter 10 in Book 2 of A Journey in Other Worlds. Recording by Tom Weiss. This is Chapter 11, Book 2 of A Journey in Other Worlds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. A Journey in Other Worlds, Book 2, Chapter 11, A Jovian Niagara. 4 days later, after crossing a ridge of mountains that the pressure on the aneroid barometer showed to be about 32,000 feet high, and a stretch of flat country a few miles in width, they came to a great arm of the sea. It was about 30 miles wide at its mouth, which was narrowed like the neck of a bottle, and farther inland was over 100 miles across, and through their glasses the clear air and the planet's size enabled them to see nearly 500 miles, they could not find its end. In the shallow water along its shores, and on the islands rising but a few feet above the waves, they saw all kinds of amphibians and sea monsters. Many of these were almost the exact reproduction in life of the giant plesiosaurs, dinosaurs, and elasmosaurs, whose remains are preserved in the museums on Earth. The reptilian bodies of the elasmosaurs, 75 feet in length, with the forked tongues, distended jaws, and fangs of a snake, were easily taken for the often described, but probably mythical, sea serpent, as partially coiled, they occasionally raised their heads 12 or 15 feet. Man in his natural state, said Cortlandt, would have but small chance of surviving long among such neighbours. Buckland, I think, once indulged in the jeu d'esprit of supposing an ichthyosaur lecturing on the human skull. You will at once perceive, said the lecturer, that the skull before us belonged to one of the lower order of animals. The teeth are very insignificant, the power of the jaws trifling, and altogether it seems wonderful how the creature could have procured food. Armed with modern weapons, and in this machine we are, of course, superior to the most powerful monster, but it is not likely that, had man been so surrounded during the whole of his evolution, he could have reached his present plane. Notwithstanding the striking similarity of these creatures to their terrestrial counterparts that existed on Earth during its corresponding period, there were some interesting modifications. The organs of locomotion in the amphibians were more developed, while the eyes of all were larger, the former being, of course, necessitated by the power of gravity, and the latter by the greater distance from the sun. The adaptability and economy of nature, said Cortlandt, have always amazed me. In the total blackness of the Kentucky Mammoth Cave, where eyes would be of no use to the fishes, our common mother has given them none, while if there is any light, though not as much as we are accustomed to, she may be depended upon to rise to the occasion by increasing the size of the pupil and the power of the eye. In the development of the ambulatory muscles, we again see her handiwork, probably brought about through the survival of the fittest. The fishes and those wholly immersed would need no increase in power, for though they weigh more than they would on Earth, the weight of the water they displace is increased at the same rate also, and their buoyancy remains unchanged. If the development of life here so closely follows its lines on Earth, with the exception of comparatively slight modifications, which are exactly what, had we stopped to think, we should have expected to find, may we not reasonably ask, whether she will not continue on those lines, and in time produce beings like ourselves, but with more powerful muscles and eyes, capable of seeing clearly with less light. Reasoning by analogy, we can come to no other conclusion, unless their advent is anticipated by the arrival of ready-made colonists from the more advanced Earth like ourselves. In that case, man, by pursuing the same destructive methods that he has pursued in regard to many other species, may exterminate the intervening links, and so arrest evolution. Before leaving Deepwaters Bay, they secured a pail of its water, which they found, on examination, contained a far larger percentage of salt and solid materials than the oceans on Earth, while a thermometer that they immediately immersed in it soon registered 85 degrees Fahrenheit.
both of which discoveries confirmed them in what they already knew, namely, that Jupiter had advanced comparatively little from the condition in which the water on the surface is hot, in which state the earth once was. They were soon beyond the estuary at which they had stopped to study the forms of life and to make this test, and kept on due north for several days, occasionally rising above the air. As their familiarity with their surroundings increased, they made notes of several things. The mountains covered far more territory at their bases than the terrestrial mountains, and they were in places very rugged, and showed vast yawning chasms. They were also wooded farther up their sides, and bore but little snow. But so far, the travellers had not found them much higher than those on earth, the greatest altitude being the 32,000 feet south of Deepwater's Bay, and one other ridge that was 40,000, so that, compared with the size of the planet and its continents, they seemed quite small, and the continents themselves were comparatively level. They also noted that spray was blown in vast sheets, till the ocean for miles was white as milk. The wind often attained tornado strength, and the whole surface of the water, about what seemed to be the storm center, frequently moved with rapidity in the form of foam. Yet, notwithstanding this, the waves were never as large as those to which they were accustomed on earth. This they accounted for very easily by the fact that, while water weighed 2.55 times as much as on earth, the pressure of air was but little more than half as much again, and consequently its effect on all but the very surface of the heavy liquid was comparatively slight. "Gravity is a useful factor here," observed Cortlandt, as they made a note of this, "for, in addition to giving immunity from waves, it is most effective in checking the elevation of high mountains or tablelands in the high latitudes, which we shall doubtless find sufficiently cool or even cold, while in tropical regions, which might otherwise be too hot, it interferes with them least, on account of being partly neutralized by the rapid rotation with which all four of the major planets are blessed." At sunrise the following morning, they saw they were approaching another great arm of the sea. It was over 1,000 miles wide at its mouth, and, had not the photographs showed the contrary, they would have thought the Callisto had reached the northern end of the continent. It extended into the land 15,000 miles, and, on account of the shape of its mouth, they called it Funnel Bay. Rising to a height, they flew across and came to a great tableland peninsula, with the chain of mountains on either side. The southern range was something over, and the northern something less than, 5,000 feet in height, while the tableland between sloped almost imperceptibly towards the middle, in which, as they expected, they found a river compared to which the Mississippi or the Amazon would be but a brook. In honor of the president of the Terrestrial Axis Straightening Company, they called this great projection, which averaged about 4,000 miles across by 12,000 miles long, Bearwarden Peninsula. They already noticed a change in climate. The ferns and palms became fewer, and were succeeded by pines, while the air was also a good deal cooler, which was easily accounted for by their altitude, though even at that height it was considerably denser than at sea level on earth, and by the fact that they were already near latitude 30. The exposed points on the plateau, as also the summits of the first mountains they had seen before alighting, were devoid of vegetation, scarcely so much as a blade of grass being visible. Since they could not account for this by cold, they concluded that the most probable explanation lay in the tremendous hurricanes that, produced by the planet's rapid rotation, frequently swept along its surface, like the earth's trade winds, but with far more violence. On reaching the northern coast of the peninsula, they increased their elevation and changed their course to northeast, not caring to remain long over the great body of water, which they named Cortlandt Bay. The thousands of miles of foam fast flew beneath them, the first thing attracting their attention being a change in the ocean's color. In the eastern shore of Cortlandt Bay they soon observed the mouth of a river, 10 miles across, from which this tinted water issued in a flood. On account of its color, which reminded them of a stream they knew so well, they christened it the Harlem. Believing that an expedition up its valley might reveal something of interest, they began the ascent, remaining at an elevation of a few hundred feet. For about 300 miles they followed this river, which had but few bends, while its sides became more and more precipitous, till it flowed through a canon 4.5 miles across. Though they knew from the wide discoloration of Cortlandt Bay that the volume of water discharged was tremendous, the stream seldom moved at a rate of more than 5 miles an hour, and for a time was free from rocks and rapids, from which they concluded that it must be very deep. Half an hour later they saw a cloud of steam or mist, which expanded and almost obscured the sky as they approached. Next they heard a sound like distant thunder, which they took for the prolonged eruption of some giant crater, though they had not expected to find one so far towards the interior of the continent. Presently it became one continuous roar, the echo in the canon, whose walls were at this place over 600 feet high, being simply deafening, so that the near discharge of the heaviest artillery would have been completely drowned. "One would think the end of the world was approaching!" shouted Cortlandt through his hands. "Look!" Bearwarden roared back. "The wind is scattering the mist." As he spoke, the vapoury curtain was drawn aside, revealing a waterfall of such vast proportions as to dwarf completely anything they had ever seen or even imagined. A somewhat open horseshoe lip, 3.5 miles straight across, and over 4 miles following the line of the curve, discharged a sheet of water 40 feet thick at the edge into an abyss 600 feet below. 2 islands on the brink divided this sheet of liquid into 3 nearly equal parts, while myriads of rainbows hovered in the clouds of spray. 2 things especially struck the observers. The water made but little curve or sweep on passing over the edge, and then rushed down to the abyss at almost lightning speed, shivering itself to infinitesimal particles on striking any rock or projection at the side. Its behaviour was, of course, due to its weight, and to the fact that on Jupiter bodies fall 40.98 feet the first second instead of 16 feet, as on earth, and at correspondingly increasing speed. Finding that they were being rapidly dazed and stunned by the noise, the travellers caused the Callisto to rise rapidly, and were soon surveying the superb sight from a considerable elevation. Their minds could grasp but slowly the full meaning and titanic power of what they saw, and not even the vast falls in their nearness could make their significance clear. Here was a sheet of water 3.5 miles wide, averaging 40 feet in depth, moving at a rapid rate towards a sheer fall of 600 feet. They felt as they gazed at it that the power of that waterfall would turn backward every engine and dynamo on the earth, and it seemed as if it might almost put out the fires of the sun. Yet it was but an illustration of the action
of the solar orb exerted on a vast area of ocean, the vapor in the form of rain being afterwards turned into these comparatively narrow limits by the topography of the continent. Compared with this, Niagara, with its descent of less than 200 feet and its relatively small flow of water, would be but a rivulet, and at best a rapid stream. Reluctantly leaving the fascinating spectacle, they pursued their exploration along the river above the falls. For the first few miles, the surface of the water was near that of the land. There were occasional rapids, but few rocks, and the foaming torrent moved at great speed, the red sandstone banks of the river being as polished as though they had been waxed. After a while, the obstructions disappeared, but the water continued to rush and surge along at a speed of 10 or 12 miles an hour, so that it would be easily navigable only for logs or objects moving in one direction. The surface of the river was soon on an average 50 feet below the edge of the banks, this depression being one result of the water's rapid motion and weight, which facilitated the carving of its channel. When they had followed up the river about 60 miles towards its source, they came upon what at first had the appearance of an ocean. They knew, however, from its elevation and the flood coming from it, that the water must be fresh, as they soon found it was. This lake was about 300 miles wide, and stretched from northeast to southwest. There was rolling land with hills about its shores, and the foliage on the banks was a beautiful shade of bluish purple instead of the terrestrial ubiquitous green. When near the Great Lake's upper end, they passed the mouth of a river on their left side, which, from its volume, they concluded must be the principal source, and therefore they determined to trace it. They found it to be a most beautiful stream, averaging 2.5 miles in width, evidently very deep, and with a full, steady current. After proceeding for several hours, they found that the general placidity grew less. The smooth surface occasionally became ruffled by projecting rocks and rapids, and the banks rose till the voyagers again found themselves in a ravine or canon. During their sojourn on Jupiter, they had had but little experience with the tremendous winds that they knew, for some reason and observation, must rage in its atmosphere. They now heard them whistling over their heads, and, notwithstanding the projection afforded by the sides of the canon, occasionally received a gust that made the Callisto swerve. They kept on steadily, however, till sunset, at which time it became very dark on account of the high banks, which rose as steeply as the Palisades on the Hudson to a height of nearly 1,000 feet. Finding a small island near the eastern bank, they were glad to secure the Callisto there for the night, below the reach of the winds, which they still heard singing loudly but with a musical note in what seemed to them like the sky. "It is incomprehensible to me," said Ayrault, as they sat at dinner, "how the sun, at a distance of 483 million miles, can raise the amount of water we have here passing us, and compared with which the discharge of the greatest river on earth would be insignificant, to say nothing of the stream we ascended before reaching this." "We must remember," replied Cortlandt, "that many of the conditions are different here from those that exist on earth. We know that some of the streams are warm and even hot, and that the temperature of Deepwater's Bay, and doubtless that of the ocean also, is considerably higher than ours. This would facilitate evaporation. The density of the atmosphere and the tremendous winds, of which I suspect we may see more later, must also help the sun very much in its work of raising vapour.
But the most potent factor is undoubtedly the vast size of the basin that these rivers drain. "The great speed at which the atmospheric currents move," said Bearwarden, "coupled with the comparative lowness of the mountain chains and the slight obstruction they offer to their passage, must distribute the rain very thoroughly, notwithstanding the great unbroken area of the continents. There can be no such state of things here as exists in the western part of South America, where the Andes are so high that any eastbound clouds, in crossing them, are shoved up so far into a cold region that all moisture they may have brought from the Pacific is condensed into rain, with which parts of the western slope are deluged, while clouds from the Atlantic have come so far they have already dispersed their moisture, in consequence of which the region just east of the Andes gets little, if any, rain. It is bad for a continent to have its high mountains near the ocean from which it should get its rain, and good for it to have them set well back." "I should not be surprised," said Cortlandt, "if we saw another waterfall tomorrow, though not in the shape of rain. In the hour before we stopped, we began to see rapids and protruding rocks. That means that we are coming to a part of the channel that is comparatively new, since the older parts have had time to wear smooth. I take it, then, that we are near the foot of a retreating cascade, which we may hope soon to see. That is exactly the order in which we found smooth water and rapids in river number 1, which we have named the Harlem." After this, not being tired, they used the remaining dark hours for recording their recent adventures. This is the end of Chapter 11 in Book 2 of A Journey in Other Worlds. Recording by Tom Weiss. This is Chapter 12, Book 2 of A Journey in Other Worlds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. A Journey in Other Worlds, Book 2, Chapter 12, Hills and Valleys. With the first light, they resumed their journey, and an hour after setting out they sighted, as Cortlandt had predicted, another cloud of vapor. The fall, for such it proved to be, was more beautiful than the other, for though the volume of water was not so great, it fell at one leap, without a break, and at the same tremendous speed, a distance of more than 1,000 feet. The cannon rang with the echoes, while the spray flew in sheets against the smooth, glistening sandstone walls. Instead of coming from a river, as the first fall had, this poured at once from the rocky lip, about 2 miles across, of a lake that was 1,100 feet above the surging mass in the vale below. "It is 1,000 pities," said Bearwarden, "that this cataract has got so near its source, for at the rate these streams must cut, this one in a few hundred years, unless something is done to prevent it, will have worn back to the lake, and then good-bye to the falls, which will become a series of rapids. Perhaps the first effect will be merely to reduce by a few feet the height of the falls, in which case they will remain in practically the same place." About the shores of this lake they saw rhinoceroses, with long, thick wool, and herds of creatures that much resembled buffaloes. "I do not see," said Bearwarden, "why the identical species should not exist here that till recently, in a geological sense, inhabited the earth. The climate and all other conditions are practically the same on both planets, except a trifling difference in weight, to which terrestrials would soon adapt themselves. We know, by spectroscopic analysis, that hydrogen, iron, magnesium, and all our best known substances exist in the sun and even the stars, while the earth contains everything we have found in meteorites. Then why make an exception of life, instead of supposing that at corresponding periods of development the same living forms inhabit all? It would be assuming the eternal sterilization of the functions of nature to suppose that our earth is the only body that can produce them. The world of organic life is so much more complex," replied Cortlandt, "than that of the crystal that it requires great continuity. So far, we certainly have seen no men, or anything like them, not even so much as a monkey, though I suppose, according to your reasoning, Jupiter has not advanced far enough to produce even that." "Exactly," replied Bearwarden, "for it will require vast periods, and according to my belief, at least half the earth's time of habitability had passed before man appeared. But we see Jupiter is admirably suited for those who have been developed somewhere else, and it would be an awful shame if we allowed it to lie unimproved till it produces appreciative inhabitants of its own, for we find more to admire in 1/2 hour than its entire present population during its lifetime. Yet how magnificent this world is, and how superior in its natural state to ours! The mountainous horns of these crescent-shaped continents protect them, and the ocean they enclose from the cold polar marine currents, and in a measure from the icy winds, while the elevated country on the horns near the equator might be a Garden of Eden or ideal resort. To be sure, the continents might support a larger population, if more broken up, notwithstanding the advantage resulting from the comparatively low mountains along the coasts and the useful winds, a greater subdivision of land and water, more great islands connected by isthmuses, and more Mediterraneans joined by straits would be a further advantage to commerce. But with the sources of power at hand, the resistless winds and water power, much increased in effectiveness by their weight, the great tides when several moons are on the same side or opposite the sun, internal heat near the surface, an abundant coal supply doubtless already formed and also near the surface, such small alterations could be made very easily, and would serve merely to prevent our becoming rusty. As Jupiter's distance from the sun varies from 506,563 miles at aphelion to only 460,013,000 miles at perihelion, this difference in connection with even the slight inclination of the axis must make a slight change in seasons, but as the inclination is practically nothing, almost the entire change results from the difference in distance. This means that the rise or fall in temperature is general on every degree of latitude, all being warmed simultaneously, more or less, as the planet approaches or departs from the sun. It means also that about the same conditions that Secretary Deepwater suggested as desirable for the earth prevail here, and that Jupiter represents, therefore, about the acme of climate naturally provided. On account of its rapid rotation and vast size, the winds have a tornado strength, but they are nothing at this distance from the sun to what they would be if a planet with its present rate of rotation and size were Venus or even Earth is. In either of these positions, no land life with which we are acquainted could live on the surface, for the slope of the atmospheric isobars, i.e., the lines of equal barometric pressure that produced wind by being tilted through unequal expansion, after which the air, as it were, flows downhill, would be too great. The ascending currents about the equator would also, of course, be vastly strengthened, so that we see a wise dispensation of Providence in placing the large planets, which also rotate so rapidly, at a great distance from the sun, which is the father of all winds, rotation alone, however rapid, being unable to produce them. They found this lake was about 6 times the size of Lake Superior, and that several large and small streams ran into its upper end. These had their sources in smaller lakes that were at slightly higher elevations. Though the air was cool, the sun shone brightly, while the ground was covered with flowers resembling those of the northern climes on earth, of all shapes and lines. Twice a day these sent up their song, and trees were covered with buds, and the birds twittered gaily. The streams murmured and bubbled, and all things reminded the travellers of early morning in spring. "If anything could reconcile me," said Bearwarden, "to exchange my active, utilitarian life for rustic, poetic existence, it would be this place, for it is far more beautiful than anything I have seen on earth. It needs but a Maud Muller and a few cows to complete the picture, since Nature gives us a vision of eternal peace and repose." Somehow the mention of Maud Muller and the delicate and refined flowers whose perfume he inhaled brought up thoughts that were never far below the surface in Ayrault's mind. "This place is heavenly enough," said he, "to make one wish to live and remain here forever, but to me it would be Hamlet with Hamlet left out." "Ah, poor chap," said Cortlandt, "you are in love, but you are not to be pitied, for though the thrusts at the heart are sharp, they may be the sweetest that mortals know." The following morning they reluctantly left the picturesque shores of Lake Serenity, with their beautiful tints and foliage, and resumed the journey to explore a number of islands in the ocean in the west, which were recorded on their negatives. Ascending to rarefied air, they saw great chains of mountains, which they imagined ran parallel to the coast, rising to considerable altitudes in the east. The tops of all glistened with a mantle of snow in the sunlight, while between the ridges they saw darker and evidently fertile valleys. They passed, moving northwest, over large and small lakes, all evidently part of the same great system, and continued to sweep along for several days, with a beautiful panorama, as varying as a kaleidoscope, spread beneath their eyes. They observed that the character of the country gradually changed. The symmetrically rounded mountains and hills began to show angles, while great slabs of rock were split from the faces. The sides also became less vertical, and there was an accumulation of detrital fragments about their bases. These heaps of fractured stone had in some cases begun to disintegrate and form soil, on which there was a scant growth of vegetation, but the sides and summits, whose jaggedness increased with their height, were absolutely bare. "Here," said Cortlandt, "we have unmistakable evidence of frost and ice action. The next interesting question is, how recently has denudation occurred? The absence of plant life at the exposed places," he continued, as if lecturing to a class, "can be accounted for here, as nearer the equator, by the violence of the wind, but I greatly doubt whether water will now freeze in this latitude at any season of the year, for even should the northern hemisphere's very insignificant winter coincide with the planet's aphelion, the necessary drop from the present temperature would be too great to be at all probable. If, then, it is granted that ice does not form here now, notwithstanding the fact that it has done so, the most plausible conclusion is that the inclination of Jupiter's axis is automatically changing, as we know the Earth's has often done. There being nothing incompatible in this view with the evidence at hand, we can safely assume it correct for the time being at least. When farther south, you remember, we found no trace of ice action, notwithstanding the comparative slowness with which we decided that the ridges in the crust had been upheaved on account of the resisting power of gravity, and, as I see now, also on account of Jupiter's great mass, which must prevent its losing its heat anything like as fast as the earth has, in which I think, also, we have the explanation of the comparatively low elevation of the mountains that we found we could not account for by the power of gravitation alone. From the fact that the exposed surface farther south must be old, on account of the slow upheaval and the slight wear to which it is exposed, about the only wearing agent being the wind, which would be powerless to erase ice scratches, especially since, on account of gravity's power, it cannot, like our desert winds, carry much sand, which, as we know, has cut away the base of the Sphinx. I think it is logical to conclude that though Jupiter's axis is changing naturally as the Earth's has been, it has never varied as much as 23.5 degrees, and certainly to nothing like the extent to which we see Venus and Uranus tilted today. "I follow you," said Bearwarden, "and do not see how we could arrive at anything else. From Jupiter's low specific gravity, weighing but little more than an equal bulk of water, I should say the interior must be very hot, or else is composed of light material, for the crust surface, or the part we see, is evidently about as dense as what we have on earth. These things have puzzled me a good deal, and I have been wondering if Jupiter may not have been formed before the earth and the smaller planets." "The discrepancies between even the best authorities," replied Cortlandt, "show that as yet but little has been discovered from the earth concerning Jupiter's real condition. The two theories that try to account for its genesis are the ring theory and the nebulous. We know that the sun is constantly emitting vast volumes of heat and light, and that with the exception of the heat resulting from the impact of falling meteors, it receives none from outside, the principal source being the tremendous friction and pressure between the cooling and shrinking strata within the great mass of the sun itself. A seeming paradox therefore comes in here, which must be considered. If the sun were composed entirely of gas, it would for a time continue to grow hotter. But the sun is incessantly radiating light and heat, and consequently becoming smaller. Therefore, the farther back we go, the hotter we find the sun, and also the larger, till, instead of having a diameter of 880,000 miles, it filled the space now occupied by the entire solar system. Here is where the two theories start. According to the first, the revolving nebulous mass threw off a ring that became the planet Neptune, afterwards another that contained the material for Uranus, and so on, the lightest substance in the sun being thrown off first, by which they accounted for the lightness of the four great planets, and finally Mars, the Earth, and the small dense planets near the sun. The advocates of this theory pointed to Saturn's rings as an illustration of the birth of a planet, or rather, in that case, a satellite. According to this, the major planets have had a far longer separate existence than the minor, which would account for their being so advanced, notwithstanding their size. This theory may again come into general acceptance, but for the present it has been discredited by the nebulous. According to this second theory, at the time the sun filled all the space inside of Neptune's orbit, or extended even further, several centres of condensation were formed within the nebulous gaseous mass. The greatest centre became the sun, and the others, large and small, the planets, which, as a result of the spiral motion of the whole, such as is now going on before our eyes in the great nebulae of 51 M Canuum Venaticorum, and many others, began to revolve about the greatest central body of gas. As the separate masses cooled, they shrank, and their surfaces, or extreme edges, which at first were contiguous, began to recede, which recession is still going on with some rapidity on the part of the sun, for we may be sure its diameter diminishes as its density increases. According to either theory, as I see it, the major planets, on account of their distance from the central mass, have had longer separate existences than the minor, and are therefore more advanced than they would be had all been formed at the same time. This theory explains the practical uniformity in the chemical composition of all members of this system by assuming that they were all once a part of the same body, and you may say brothers and sisters of the sun, instead of its offspring. It also makes size the only factor determining temperature and density, but of course modified by age, since otherwise Jupiter would have had a far less developed crust than that with which we find it. I have always considered the period from the molten condition to that with a crust as comparatively short, which stands to reason, for radiation has then no check, and the period from the formation of the crust, which acts as a blanket, to the death of a planet as very long. I have not found this view clearly set forth in any of the books I have read, but it seems to me the simplest and most natural explanation. Now, granted that the solar system was once a nebula, on which I think everyone will agree, the same forces that changed it into a system of sun and planets must be at work on 51 M Canum Venaticorum, Andromeda, and 99 M Virginis, and must inevitably change them to suns, each with doubtless a system of planets. If then the condition of a nebula or star depends simply on its size, it is reasonable to suppose that Andromeda, Sirius, and all the vast bodies we see were created at the same time as our system, which involves the necessity of one general and simultaneous creation day. But as Sirius, with its diameter of 12 million miles, must be larger than some of the nebula will be when equally condensed, we must suppose rather that nebula are forming and coming into the condition of bright and dead stars, much as apples or pears on a fruit tree are constantly growing and developing, so that the mosaic description of the creation would probably apply in point of time only to our system, or perhaps to our globe, though the rest will doubtless pass through precisely the same stages. This, I think, I will publish on our return, as the Cortlandt astronomical doctrine, as the most rational I have seen devised, and one that I think we may safely believe, until perhaps, through increased knowledge, it can be disproved. After they crossed a line of hills that ran at right angles to their course, they found the country more rolling. All streams and watercourses flowed in their direction, while their aneroid showed them that they were gradually descending. When they were moving along near the surface of the ground, a delicious and refined perfume exhaled by the blue and white flowers that had been growing smaller as they journeyed northward frequently reached their nostrils. To Cortlandt and Bearwarden it was merely the scent of a flower, but to Ayrault it recalled mental pictures of Sylvia wearing violets and lilies that he had given her. He knew that the greatest telescopes on earth could not reveal the Callisto moving about in Jupiter's sunshine, as even a point of light at that distance, and notwithstanding Cortlandt's learning and Bearwarden's joviality, he felt at times extremely lonely. They swept along steadily for 50 hours, having bright sunny days and beautifully moonlit nights. They passed over finely rounded hills and valleys and well-watered plains. As they approached the ocean and its level, the temperature rose, and there was more moisture in the air. The plants and flowers also increased in size, again resembling somewhat the large species they had seen near the equator. "This would be the place to live," said Bearwarden, looking at iron mountains, silver, copper, and lead formations, primeval forests, rich prairies, and regions evidently underlaid with coal and petroleum,
not to mention huge beds of aluminum, clay, and other natural resources that made his materialistic mouth water. It would be joy and delight to develop industries here, with no snow avalanches to clog your railroads, or icy blizzards to paralyze work, nor weather that blights you with sunstrokes and fevers. On our return to the earth, we must organize a company to run regular interplanetary lines. We could start on this globe all that is best on our own. Think what boundless possibilities may be before the human race on this planet, which, on account of its vast size, will be in its prime when our insignificant earth is cold and dead, and no longer capable of supporting life. Think also of the indescribable blessing to the congested communities of Europe and America to find an unlimited outlet here. Mars is already past its prime, and Venus scarcely habitable, but in Jupiter we have a new promised land, compared with which our Earth is a pygmy, or but little more than microscopic. "I see," said Ayrault, "that the possibilities here have no limit, but I do not see how you can compare it to the promised land, since till we undertook this journey no one had even thought of Jupiter as a habitable place." "I trace the divine promise," replied Bearwarden, "in what you describe to us on earth as man's innate longing and desire to rise, and in the fact that the Almighty has given the race unbounded expansiveness in a very limited space. This would look to me as the return of man to the Garden of Eden through intellectual development, for here every man can sit under his own vine and fig tree." "It seems to me," said Cortlandt, "that no paradise or heaven described in anything but the Bible compares with this. According to Virgil's description, the joys on the banks of the river Lethe must have been most sad and dreary, the general idleness and monotony apparently being broken only by wrestling matches between the children, while the rest strolled about with laurel wreaths or rested in the shade. The pilot Palinurus, who had been drowned by falling overboard while asleep, but who before that had presumably done his duty, did not seem especially happy, while the harsh, resentful disposition evidently remained unsoftened, for Dido became like a cliff of Marpesian marble when Aeneas asked to be forgiven, though he had doubtless considered himself in duty bound to leave her, having been twice commanded to do so by Mercury, the messenger of Jove. She, like the rest, seems to have had no occupation, while the consciences of few appear to have been sufficiently clear to enable them to enjoy the unbroken rest. The idleness in the spirit land of all profane writers," added Bearwarden, "has often surprised me too, though I have always recommended a certain amount of recreation for my staff, in fact, more than I have generally had myself. An excess of it becomes a bore. I think that all real progress comes through thorough work. Why should we assume that progress ceases at death? I believe in the verse that says, 'We learn here on earth those things, the knowledge of which is perfected in heaven.'" "According to that," said Cortlandt, "you will some day be setting the axis of heaven right, for in order to do work there must be work to be done, a necessary corollary to which is that heaven is still imperfect." "No," said Bearwarden, bristling up at the way Cortlandt sometimes received his speeches, "it means simply that its development, though perfect so far as it goes, may not be finished, and that we may be the means, as on earth, of helping it along." "The conditions constituting heaven," said Ayrault, "may be as fixed as the laws of nature, though the products of those conditions might, it seems to me, still be forming and subject to modification thereby." The reductio ad absurdum would, of course, apply if we supposed the work of creation absolutely finished. This is the end of Chapter 12, in Book 2 of A Journey in Other Worlds, recording by Tom Weiss.